Hello to you newcomers and welcome back, my lovely subscribers. This is Big Baby Props and I'm the Big Baby. And in today's episode I'm going to be showing you guys how I made my Coruscant Guard officer helmet from Star Wars Battlefront 2 video game. This helmet started as a 3D print and ended as what you see before you. I'm going to be showing you guys step by step how I smooth it, paint it, and weather it. Before we get started, I did want to mention that I sell the raw 3D print of this helmet in my shop online, so if you want to support the channel and complete this project at the same time, be sure and check out that link in the description. Now let's get into it. Luckily for us, this helmet can be printed in one piece on a CR10, so we won't have to worry about joining the edges or sanding any edges or anything like that. We can jump right into using the filler primer you see there from Rust-Oleum to fill in most of the 3D printer lines. This stuff is kind of like a really thick spray paint, and what it's going to do is it's going to fill in the layer lines on the helmet to give us a nice and smooth finish. Now this step we're going to shoot for smoothing out 80% of the layer lines with about 20% of the work. So this filler primer is going to fill itself into those 3D printer lines and give us a nice smooth finish that we can paint on. I typically do 3 to 4 really heavy coats with this stuff. I say heavy coats because it's not going to really matter if it drips or runs a little bit, because we're going to be sanding the hell out of this thing. So any runs or anything are not a big deal at this step. They will be later on, but not yet. So a word of warning for using this stuff: it smells really bad. You don't want to use it inside. You might hesitate to use it in a garage even. So you can see I'm outside wearing a respirator to protect myself from the nasty fumes that this stuff makes. Now naturally the helmet is going to have some thicker layer lines at the top and near the bottom. Don't worry too much about those for now. You would have to use a lot of filler primer in order to fill those, and generally there are easier methods that we're going to cover next. So again, you don't have to fill all of the layer lines with this, but shoot for around 80%. Any larger layer lines or defects we'll fill in later. And as you can see, the helmet has kind of a nice shine on it. That's how you know that there's material working itself into the print lines. So that's what you want to go for. Remember, go for about 3 to 4 layers, maybe more if you need, waiting about 20 minutes in between each layer to let it dry a little bit. And once that's done, we'll move on to the next step. So now that we've got our nice gray semi-smooth helmet, we're going to be using another material to really fill in some of those heavy lines at the top, bottom, and a few other places. The product we're going to be using is called Bondo Glazing and Spot Putty. If you guys have been making props at all for very long, you definitely know what Bondo is. For this, you're going to want some gloves and a respirator or other lung protection. Now this stuff is like toothpaste, basically. You squeeze it out of a tube, and I like to rub it on with my finger so I can get a nice even spread. But basically you rub it on, and after about half an hour it'll harden up, and then what you can do is sand it away, and what you're left with is a very smooth surface. So we're going to be applying this stuff all over the helmet. Basically any layer line that the filler primer couldn't fill in, we're going to fill in with this Bondo stuff. This stuff is great. It's really going to act as a catch-all for any imperfections that you might see in the print or any layer lines that got left behind. Because filler primer is great, but it doesn't catch everything. Bondo is also great, but it can be kind of tedious to apply Bondo to the entire helmet. So that's why we used the filler primer first, to get most of the layer lines out of the way. Now the filler primer and Bondo you can generally find in the automotive section of most of like big retail grocery stores, but I'll be sure and leave a link to them both in the description. Now you can see me applying it to the face area in this video, but not super necessary. I like to apply Bondo to any parts of the print that are basically, they must be perfect. So in this case, obviously the front of the helmet needs to look the best. So I'll generally apply a bit more Bondo just anywhere that I want it to be perfect. I'll generally do thicker layers at the top or bottom, wherever the larger printer lines are, and then thinner layers of bondo, or like around the face, like you're seeing now. Now, bondo does sell larger containers of this stuff, but you have to mix it yourself, and I generally find it easier to just squeeze it out of a tube and apply it with your finger. If you mix it yourself, you run the risk of your bondo hardening before you're ready, and this stuff just works a lot better for smaller details that, exist on a helmet. So you're definitely going to want to use your fingers to really get the bondo in some of those tight and small places. Once the bondo has fully set, give it, a few hours. Maybe you even let it rest overnight. We can move on to the next step, sanding. So sanding is definitely going to be the hardest part of this whole process. It takes the most amount of time and energy. What we're going to do is try and minimize that as best we can. So you can see me starting with a mouse sander with around 150 grit sandpaper pads. I've got some hand sandpaper pads as well as more filler primer. So if you're using a machine like this, you're going to want a respirator and maybe some eye protection while you're at it. I use the mouse sander as basically just a first pass, since it is, so powerful. It might sand away more than you want. So I like to just go over the entire helmet with it once to, really flake off the rough bondo specks that we might have had on, or generally make my hand sanding process as short as possible. Just be very careful not to oversand and accidentally damage the helmet. So once you've made a pass through with the mouse sander, grab your 150 grit sandpaper and follow it up on the rest of the helmet. After you've done that, move up in grit of sandpaper for a smoother finish. I typically only go up to 300 grits, but theoretically you could go as high as you wanted. The higher the grit, the smoother the surface you're going to be left with. I generally find that 300 grit is good enough for me. So just keep increasing the grits of sandpaper until you're happy with the finish you have. Now, more than likely, your first sanding process, you'll find a few errors, or you'll find a few defects with your helmet that you missed before. That is why, at the end of this, I apply another coat of filler primer. That stuff really also is a great way of seeing those deformities or layer lines that you might have missed. At that point, I would apply more filler primer, more bondo if I need to, and then resand, probably with just the handheld 150 grit sandpaper, and then again with the 300. So you'll repeat these last 3 steps as many times as you need until you're happy with the smoothness of your helmet. By the end of it, your helmet should be perfectly smooth. It shouldn't have any layer lines that you can see, and it should be completely dust free. So be sure and bring a microfiber cloth with you to wipe off all the sanding dust that you'll make. Once you can get past this step, that's where the fun really begins. So let's move on. Now that we've got our perfectly smooth helmet, we can start to make it look more like a clone trooper. So for that, we're going to need a base coat of white. Now I use a flat white, but you could also use a glossy white. It's kind of up to you. I use a flat white since we'll be weathering it anyway, and that kind of dulls the shine of any glossy white that you would use. Now it's very important at this step to take your time. Do 4 or 5 very light coats of spray paint. If you get any runs in your paint, you're going to have to wait for them to dry and then sand them out, because those we cannot tolerate at this step. We need our helmet to stay smooth and look perfect. Now I didn't include footage for the next step simply because I didn't think it would be very interesting, but we're going to need to tape the helmet once the white has dried so we can follow it up with our red. So go ahead, get some painter's tape and tape out the outline of whatever you're going to need to be the color red. Now as you can see, I've got the helmet all taped up. This is a pretty time-consuming process, but easy enough to do on the couch watching Netflix or something. So before we do our red paint job, we're going to be applying a little bit of liquid latex with some cotton swabs. Now this liquid latex comes out as a liquid, but after about an hour or so, it will kind of thicken up and become solid. After that, we'll be able to paint over it and then peel away the latex, giving it like a chipped paint look. So just dip in your cotton swab and rub it onto the helmet in a few places. You can definitely go overboard with this step, so use it sparingly. I like to just apply it in a few places like the mouth, some of the rectangles above the brow line, and anywhere you think might receive a bit of damage. We're going to let the latex thicken up and harden, and then we can follow it up with the red paint. So let's do that. Now I used a Krylon Gloss Cherry Red. Similar to the painting white stage, you're going to want to take this very slow. Any streaks or runs at this step, unacceptable. So patience is key. You also want to make sure that your tape is firmly secured to your helmet. I've had it before where I go to paint after I applied the tape like a few days ago, and when I go to paint, some of the tape flaps off and I end up painting what I didn't intend to. So just go around the helmet and make sure that all your tape is nice, tight, and secure and won't fly up. Once you've painted the entire helmet, we get to do one of the most satisfying parts of the whole process and peel that tape off. Now untaping is pretty straightforward. Just peel the tape off. Just be sure and take it kind of slow. I've accidentally done it before where I'll peel off some of the paint, some of the filler primer, and some of the bondo, and so like it just lifts right off the helmet sometimes. So pull kind of slowly. The tape comes off easy enough. The latex you can rub off with your finger and you'll start to see why we did it in the first place. It really gives that illusion that the helmet has been in battle and is chipped in a few places. This is really going to set the dopamine off inside your brain because it just feels so dang good peeling off the tape to reveal the awesome looking design that you have underneath. Now obviously the helmet includes a few other colors like some gray, some black. The gray band around the back of the head I just did in a similar fashion, just taped it off and then painted it with a gray spray paint. If there's any paint that got underneath your tape in some places, what you can do is I took an X-Acto knife and kind of just scratched it away. It worked out pretty well where I didn't remove much of the white paint but got rid of the extra red paint that I had laying around. So the next few steps are going to cover some weathering techniques. We're going to make this thing look like it's seen some battle action. So let's get to it. Now this is a simple technique but is very effective at making the helmet look aged. You're going to need a sponge brush, a cup filled with a little bit of water, and some black acrylic paint, as well as some paper towels. Some gloves are also handy. Now what you want to do is mix some of the black acrylic paint into the water and stir it up to make kind of a muddy black mixture. We are going to paint this mixture onto the helmet, and it's really going to make it look dirty. We're going to paint it off in small sections and then wait a few seconds for the paint to kind of settle in. And then what we'll do is we'll take our paper towels and wipe off the paint. Now, we won't be wiping off all the paint. Some of it will stay behind and kind of dirty up the surface, as well as make its way into all the nooks and crannies of the helmet. And it's really going to make it look realistic and dirty. Mostly because it works the same way that real life does. You know, if you think about it, the areas that get brushed off easily are the cleanest, whereas the areas that are recessed and kind of harder to reach remain the dirtiest. So we're going to want to try and follow that convention with our wiping. You know, don't be too thorough with it. It's okay to just kind of brush over it slightly. You obviously want to make sure that you don't have any streaks of water running down the helmet, because those will set and it really doesn't look realistic when there's a single black streak going down the side of your helmet. So be sure and look out for those. Basically just take the helmet in small, manageable sections, going around until you're happy. It can be kind of tricky to get the right paint to water mixture at first, so don't worry if you need to add some more paint or take out some water. I find it's generally easier to start out with too much water and then keep adding paint as you progress. You can always do another layer to get it a little bit dirtier, but it can be kind of hard to remove the paint if you did too much. The best part about this step is that there are an infinite number of possibilities you can do. You can make it slightly weathered, which is kind of what I'm going for, or you can make it absolutely nasty. It all depends on the paint to water mixture that you have. The more paint you have, the darker your weathering finish is going to be. The more water you have in there, the lighter it's going to be. So kind of experiment with your mixture until you get the desired effect. Once you're happy with how it looks, we're going to move on to another weathering technique. This next step is also pretty simple, but it's going to add a lot to the effect that we're going for. So grab some very low grit sandpaper. Here I use about 60, so very rough stuff. What we're going to do is just take our helmet and scratch it up a little bit with the very heavy sandpaper. This is going to give it some very realistic scratches and wear and tear. So just go around the helmet and scratch it up in a few places that you think would also receive some damage. In my case, I did the front face, the mohawk brow, and a few other places. Where this stuff really shines is on some edges. So you can see me kind of sanding away the edge of the mohawk, and that reveals the white underneath. That really gives it the realistic effect of the corner edges rubbing off the paint first, which is how it works in real life. Again, don't go overboard with this step. Don't apply it everywhere. Obviously, some parts of the helmet are going to be more weathered than other parts, so keep that in mind as you're going through this. We've got one more thing to do before we're finished with the entire helmet, so let's get right to it. As you all know, the clone troopers have visors, so for that we're going to be using this Hobart face shield. I got this off of Amazon, and I'll be sure and leave a link to it in the description. So what we're going to do is just cut out a section of the face shield, and then I find that duct tape is kind of the best solution for holding it in place. It's not the prettiest solution, I know, but hey, it works. So I just cut out a section of the visor and fold it to fit the helmet. Now this step can be a little tricky because the visor material isn't super flexible, so you'll kind of want to cut it to exact shape. That way it has less things bumping it and kind of just messing with the visor. You want it to be just barely big enough, but also big enough so that you can tape it down with duct tape and not have it be exactly in your eyes, you know. So when you've got the visor in, congratulations guys. If you followed all the steps to this point, you should have a fully finished Coruscant Guard officer helmet. I really love how this thing turned out. It's part of my personal armor project. Be sure and check out that playlist if you haven't already. I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you're able to complete this project at home. Do remember that I do sell the print that we started off with in my shop online, so be sure and check that out if you want to complete this project on your own. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.